Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about 15 books that I think you should consider reading this winter season. Winter is my favorite season, and here in the northeast of the United States, it's really beginning to feel like winter. I'm someone who is, oddly I think, very affected by their environment, but I like to play into that while reading. That is, I like to try my best to match my reading to my environment as best I can, because I find that that really heightens the reading experience in so many different ways. So if I go to the DMV, I bring Kafka. If I go to the dentist, I bring Cartarescu. You get my point. So in this video, I really want to talk about books that have a very wintry aesthetic, but books that I think are best read in winter, though you can read them whenever you want. And these books are mainly from Northern Europe, mainly from Iceland and Norway, as those are just two countries that I read from a lot. But these books don't just take place in winter, right? They don't just have that wintry aesthetic that I do love, to be fair, but I think that they really just embody winter and embody the atmosphere of winter. Think Bruegel's The Hunters in the Snow. These books are often about isolation and separateness in a cold and unforgiving world. They're often quiet and meditative and reflective. All of these things that I, and so many authors apparently as well, often associate with winter. So without further ado, let's just jump into it, beginning with a short story or a novella that I just reread recently. I just taught it recently, actually. And it really sparked the idea for this video. And that is easily one of the greatest English language short stories of all time. And that is none other than James Joyce's The Dead, the final story in his collection, Dubliners. And while it is the final short story in this collection, you can read it as a separate entity. And what it is essentially is about a man named Gabriel Conroy and his wife, Greta Conroy, as they attend a holiday party. And they reflect in their own ways on their life, on their marriage, on Ireland as a concept and as a nation. And most especially, they reflect on their connections to the past. This short story really asks us, what do we owe the dead? What do we owe the past? But it includes just genuinely some of the greatest writing in the English language. I really don't think that's hyperbole at all. And the prose is especially gorgeous, I think, when it's describing the wintry snowstorm that's happening just outside of the confines of the warm party. The very last sentence, which isn't really a spoiler, but it really just embodies winter in all of its different ways. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, upon all the living and the dead. It's just magnificent. And if you haven't read this short story, or if you haven't read it in a long time, this winter holiday season is the perfect time to revisit it. It's simply gorgeous. The next up is the Heaven and Hell trilogy by the Icelander Jon Stefánsson. This is probably my favorite on the list, my personal favorite. I just absolutely adore this trilogy. I love Jon Stefánsson as a writer, and I think this trilogy is his best. It follows a young man in the incredibly remote West Fjords of Iceland around the year 1900. He's a dreamer of a young man who lives in an incredibly harsh world, but he's constantly reading an Icelandic translation of Milton's Paradise Lost, which includes this line that he keeps repeating to himself, "Nothing is sweet to me without thee." But he also works on this fishing boat, which is incredibly dangerous. And he has this very close best friend named Bjartur, and their relationship is just beautiful. But this trilogy really just explores what it's like to live in an incredibly remote part of an already pretty remote island in the north. And it's about the human connections that are made despite, or perhaps because of, that environment. But again, for me, it's really the prose that makes this book so worth reading. It's the prose that makes me recommend this book and this author to damn near everyone I talk to. Jon Kalman's books are more like prose poems than novels, and Heaven and Hell is, again, I think, one of his very best. It reads like an extended poem full of these reflective and lyrical meditations. I push Jon Stefánsson on pretty much everyone, as I really think that he's a contemporary author that more people should be reading. And this really is just one of the most perfect books for a wintry atmosphere, though it's also a perfect book for pretty much any other time of the year as well. The third book on my list is a book I actually just read like 2 weeks ago, and that is Ice by Anna Kavan. And my God, is this book good. This book now ranks pretty highly among my favorite post-apocalyptic novels. It takes place in this post-apocalyptic world that is covered by ice, and the ice is constantly and slowly but surely moving in on human civilization and slowly crushing everything in its path. And the survivors are dealing with this impending doom as they know at some point the entire Earth is going to be covered in ice and they'll be extinct in the not too distant future. But Ice isn't just a straightforward apocalyptic novel. The unnamed narrator is very unreliable, and so this book is very confusing and you never quite get your footing. You explore this just gorgeously described wintry landscape from the perspective of a man who at times feels like Humbert Humbert from Lolita and at other times feels like Harry Goldfarb from Requiem for a Dream. He's this abusive and controlling man, and it's always kind of unclear what exactly he wants, but what he's essentially doing is pursuing this young albino girl throughout the world. He's just chasing her and he never quite gets her. But so he's on this quest and he just, again, explores this just wintry hellscape. And Kavan's writing style is just brilliant. It creates an incredible atmosphere that is at times surreal and completely otherworldly. Ice is about ecological disasters. It's about the Cold War. It's about addiction. It's about sexuality. It's about patriarchy. It's about snow in the exact same way that James Joyce's The Dead is in many ways about snow. It really is an incredible book whose wintry atmosphere is creepy and unnerving in the way that winter can be. The next book on my list is a book that for the past 5 years or so, I reread every year on the first real snowfall of the year. I don't know. Does anyone else mark the occasion with anything like that? Probably not. But that is Sjón's The Blue Fox. Sjón is another Icelandic author that I really admire. He's famously worked with Björk. He co-wrote the film The Northman with Robert Eggers. And he's simply just one of my favorite Icelandic authors. I've already done a full review of this book in particular, and I've done reviews of Sjón's other books in the past, so I'll be as brief here as possible. But this book follows a hunter hunting a fox, a blue fox, through the highlands of Iceland in the middle of winter. It's a very simple narrative of hunter and hunted. And this book is really just part fable, part fairy tale, and part myth. But it's brilliantly wrought in this minimalistic prose. It's super tight and contained. And like good fairy tales, it's a very short narrative that just demands to be read and reread again and again. This book embodies winter in so many ways. And if you've never read Icelandic literature before, Sjón would be a pretty good place to start, I think. And let's stay in Iceland for the next pick, which is Independent People by Halldór Laxness. Halldór Laxness is undoubtedly the most famous modern Icelandic author. He is the only Icelander to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which he won in 1955. And Independent People is undoubtedly his most famous book. And for very good reason. It's a wonderful book. Like Heaven and Hell, it takes place at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's really a social realist novel about the struggle between man and modernity. It's very much in the vein of John Steinbeck or Knut Hamsun, as our main character, Bjartor of Summer Houses, is a fiercely independent farmer, and he's a completely ordinary farmer who is living in a changing world, but the only thing that he cares about is remaining an independent person. And he's very wary of modernity because he's scared that he's going to lose that independence. It's really an epic novel, though, that really encapsulates Iceland's struggle with modernity, as Iceland is fighting at this time to get out of the colonial rule of Denmark, which it's been under for hundreds of years. And so it's really about Iceland's transition into the modern world as an independent state, which it will become shortly after this book is published. It's an incredible book, though, and if you're only ever in your life going to read one book by one Icelander, this is probably the book that most people would recommend. Go check out, I've done a full review of his recently retranslated book, Salko Valka, where I go through a bit more context on Halldór Laxness and kind of his life. So if you're interested in Laxness, go check out that video. But everyone should read Independent People. It's one of the great books of the 20th century. The next up on my list is Jon Fosse's Septology. You knew this was coming, right? Jon Fosse is one of my favorite contemporary authors, and Septology is, as of right now, his magnum opus. And it's certainly one of the very best books published this year. I've already done a full hour-long review of this novel, so I'll be brief here. But this book truly is the perfect winter read, and it's the perfect book to read in the days leading up to Christmas. as this book takes place in Bergen in Norway on the days leading up to Christmas. And it follows a man named Asla who just contemplates life's big questions concerning art, death, and God. It's a very religious book in a lot of ways, but I think it's also a very existential book. But quite interestingly, this Asla has a kind of doppelganger, another man who lives in Bergen who is also named Asla. Only this Asla is an alcoholic, and he's really struggling with this addiction, and he's living a very lonely and sad life. And so there are all these interesting questions concerning identity as these two Aslas sort of begin blending together into a single Asla. And of course it's written in Fosse's notorious, stark, minimalistic prose with no full stops. And it's just a wonderfully meditative book. It's really just a reading experience like no other, as it searches for God in God's silence. It's really astonishingly good. It's reminiscent of Samuel Beckett, and now is, I think, the perfect time to jump upon the hype train and finally read Septology. It's really, really worth your time. And let's move to another contemporary Norwegian author, and that is Hanne Ørstavik, especially her book Love, which was translated into English just a few years ago, I believe in 2018 or so. And it's quite short. You can read this book over the course of a single evening. It's about a woman named Vibeke and her son, Jon. Over the course of an evening, at the beginning of this novel, they become separated. They each have their own plans for the evening. Jon goes out to explore the town during a snowstorm, and Vibeke stays home and gets ready for a date. And I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but the main reason why you should read this is because of the prose. Hanne Ørstavik's prose is gorgeous, and the atmosphere that she creates on this wintry northern night is just so tangible. This book is really about the distance between this mother and son, as they each explore their own worlds, but they're always connected by their love, as they're constantly thinking about each other. And the narrative really plays with this as it constantly jumps back and forth between Vibeke's perspective and Jon's perspective, as they're each in very different states of mind and they're very much interested in very different things. But it's really just a fantastic book. And I'll also mention her more recently translated, this came out I think just the beginning of this year, her book The Pastor, which also takes place in northern rural Norway and is very worth reading. Hanne Ørstavik is a very important voice coming out of Norway right now. Number 8 on my list is Tarjei Vesaas's The Ice Palace. This is a list video. Of course, I'm going to mention Tarjei Vesaas. Similar in a lot of ways to Ørstavik's Love, The Ice Palace really explores from a child's perspective, the wonder and fear of exploring a snowy and icy northern Norwegian landscape. The Ice Palace follows this young girl called Sis, who meets up with this very mysterious other young girl named Un, as they, after school, explore this ice palace, this massive block of ice that has been formed by a waterfall. The Ice Palace is really about growing up and understanding the fragility of life. It's about death, and it's about youth. It's a really simple story told in stark and minimalist prose that, just like Sjón's The Blue Fox, reads more like a fable than a novel at times. And just like The Birds, The Ice Palace absolutely packs a punch. This is a classic of Norwegian literature, and so if you care at all about Norwegian literature or Nordic literature more generally, this is a modern classic that you should absolutely read. The next on my list is The Northwater by Ian McGuire. Now this book is very different in a lot of ways than the likes of Sjón or Ørstavik or Vesaas, in that this book is more outrightly harsh and brutal. The Northwater explores a whaling ship as it explores the far reaches of Canada and Greenland. And it's very much in the vein of and very much inspired by Herman Melville's Moby Dick, of course, because it's following a whaling ship, but it's also very much inspired, I think, by Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. McCarthy's opening line to Blood Meridian, "See the child," here is transposed as "Behold the man." The Northwater also has a judge-like villain in Henry Drax, and it really just explores the brutality of the whaling industry and the brutality and harsh reality of what goes on a whaling vessel. This book is obscenely violent, but it captures the savage and untamable atmosphere of these North Waters in a disturbingly beautiful way. It's cold, wet, harsh, and ruthless. This isn't my favorite book necessarily. I do find it to be too kind of consciously derivative of both of the books that I just mentioned. But it does create this wintry northern atmosphere, and it depicts these characters who are fully created by this brutal and stark landscape in a way that I do really like. There's a scene in here which depicts a seal hunt that is just, well, very, very grim. It hasn't left my head since. Number 10 on my list is The Bear Woman by Karolina Ramqvist. This was translated from the Swedish into English just this year. This novel is in that blurry realm of autofiction, but what it really does is it retells this story of a woman, a certain woman named Marguerite de la Roque, who was a 16th century French noblewoman who was on a ship with her husband exploring the coast of northern Canada when her husband accused her of infidelity and suspected her of being unfaithful. And so he kicked her off the boat on a small island in the north of Canada alongside her maid and her lover. And so this book is really about her survival on this island. And I forgot to mention, she's also pregnant during this time. And so she's surviving while pregnant this freezing cold landscape, this freezing cold and very dangerous landscape with almost no human contact. And this is, of course, by the way, a historical person. This is a real story that she's retelling. But alongside her retelling the story of Marguerite de la Roque, this book also flips back and forth to modern-day Stockholm, where a young mother and author who is very similar in a lot of ways to Karolina Ramqvist herself is researching this story. And the thing she's most interested in is how this story of Marguerite de la Roque was told and retold throughout the centuries, mostly by men, and how they told and revised and added on and omitted parts of this story. And what she's trying to do in some ways is get back at the truth of what actually happened during this time that she was abandoned on this island. It's a really interesting book in so many different ways. It's really kind of a feminist critique of history writing, etc. But the scenes that focus on Marguerite de la Roque just fighting for her survival while pregnant on this small island are disturbing, but it also really just captures that isolation of that northern wintry landscape. Number 11 on my list is The Blizzard by Vladimir Sorokin. Sorokin is a contemporary Russian author, and The Blizzard retells a kind of familiar realist story that we've seen in other 19th century Russian writers about a man going through the woods during a blizzard before he needs to seek refuge in a random peasant's house. It kind of has that fairy tale vibe to it. But of course, this is Sorokin, and so things get real weird real quick. The Blizzard follows a man named Dr. Gawain, who is on his way to a pretty remote village where a pandemic has broken out and people are dying and turning into zombies, allegedly. And so he's bringing them a vaccine. And this story kind of takes place in the 19th century, but there's all of these really strange anachronisms and a kind of fantastic as Sorokin is, again, playing with this sort of fairy tale structure of being trapped in a house during a blizzard with a group of random strangers. And as the blizzard gets stronger and as Dr. Gawain travels further and further into the blizzard, things get stranger and stranger. It's fun, funny, surreal, political. It's the perfect winter read if you find yourself this winter trapped inside due to a blizzard. I really recommend this one a lot. The next up on my list is A Fist or a Heart by Kristín Eiríksdóttir. And this is another contemporary Icelandic novel that is both very meditative and reflective. It follows a woman who is, I think, in her 60s or 70s, living in more or less modern day Reykjavik. And she's kind of a loner, but she meets this other young woman who is also a loner called Ellen, who is a playwright, and they become fast friends, or at least acquaintances. And this book really circles these two women, one younger and one older. And it contemplates their loneliness and both of their individual desires for connection. It's a meditative book about trauma, and it's really about what connects us and what separates us. It's really just one of those great meditative and reflective books that is only elevated by the stark northern wintry landscape of Reykjavik. Number 13 on my list is Karitas Untitled by Kristín Marja Baldursdóttir. This book was actually just translated this year. It just came out over the summer, but Kristín Marja is a really established Icelandic author, though this is her English language debut. She very much writes, as far as I can tell, in the vein of someone like Halldór Laxness, in that she writes these very social realist novels. And she often focuses, as she does in Karitas Untitled, on artist types in Iceland, but she refocuses all of this on the lives of Icelandic women. Karitas Untitled is a kind of Bildungsroman, as it focuses on a woman called Karitas in the first half of the 20th century, as she tries to negotiate her place in society as both an artist and a woman, two things which are, in some views of society, contradictory. And so it's really about this internal struggle of identity and this external struggle against society. It reminded me a lot of authors like Tove Ditlevsen, Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, Elena Ferrante. And Karitas Untitled is, just like many of Laxness's books, epic in scope, as even when it focuses so much on a single individual's life, what it's really about is Icelandic society at large. It really encapsulates Icelandic history throughout the 20th century. The life of Karitas is the life of all women in Iceland in the first half of the 20th century. This is a really great book that didn't get enough love when it was published, but it also just has an absolutely beautiful cover. I mean, come on. It's a very good book, and I highly recommend it. The next book on my list, and I promise this is the last Icelander, is Ófeigur Sigurðsson's Öræfi, or The Wasteland. This is a strange book, and one that I actually wouldn't just recommend to just anybody. But if you're the kind of reader who's into kind of postmodern literature and is into words and etymologies and these kind of linguistic echoes, this is a really interesting book that was published just a few years ago by Deep Vellum. It's about this Austrian man who travels to this region in southeast Iceland called Öræfi, or the Wasteland. And Öræfi is this massive region that is just covered in volcanic rock, but it's also outside these just magnificently gorgeous national parks like Skaftafelli, and underneath the looming giant volcano Vatnajökull and all these other volcanoes that litter this landscape. And so it's this really interesting region that is, again, this kind of wasteland that is directly adjacent to this mountainous, gorgeous area that people travel all around the world to see. And so our protagonist travels here to study mainly topography. He wants to study the names of the mountains and the names of the glaciers and volcanoes. And he's really interested in how these naming conventions have sort of shaped Icelandic history and Icelandic identity. And so it's interested in Old Norse, topography, mythology, folklore, the history of science, etc., and how all of that is just embedded in the names of Icelandic features in the Icelandic landscape. It's a really difficult book to describe, but when it came out, it won all of the Icelandic literary awards, and it won the Nordic Council Literature Prize, etc. It's one of my favorite contemporary Icelandic books, and I cannot wait for his other book to be translated and for Ófeigur to write more books. And finally, the last book on my list is none other than Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. You didn't think I was going to do a whole list video without mentioning at least one medieval text. It's killing me to not mention the Icelandic sagas in this video. But the reason I'm mentioning Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is that this poem is a Christmas story. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a Middle English poem. It's one of the very best Middle English poems, I think. But it takes place in and around Christmas. It opens during the Christmas festivities at Camelot, where they are feasting and partying in King Arthur's court. But these festivities they come to a shocking halt as a giant green man on a giant green horse comes barging right into the main hall. And he issues a challenge to all of the knights of the Round Table. A simple challenge of a blow for a blow, an axe hit for an axe hit. But this game quickly becomes quite disturbing, as it quickly becomes a game of beheading. It's a whole thing, but this poem really is interested in the problems of chivalry, the problems of the ideals of chivalry. And it's interested in honor and courtly culture, but it's also interested in gender and sexuality. This poem contains some medieval BDSM, which is quite fun, but it's also very much about the haunting of the pagan past on the Christian present. If you know anything about the history of Christmas and its kind of pagan roots, you'll know what I mean. But this poem also just includes these wonderful descriptions as Sir Gawain is traveling through the whirl during a snowstorm. He's traveling through this wintry landscape as he goes off in search of this quest. It's a fantastic poem that is, again, I think, about Christmas time. And it's a poem that if you haven't read it, or if you haven't read it since high school or college, I strongly recommend rereading it. It's really quite a lot of fun, I think. And all right, that's my list. I tried to limit myself as best I could here. This very quickly turned from a 10 books to read in winter to a 12 books to read in winter to a 15 books to read in winter. So apologies for that, but know that I could have kept going. Perhaps someday I'll do a bookshelf tour of my Nordic books, as so many Nordic books could be on this list. But let me know your favorite winter reads, especially books that aren't from Nordic countries. I fully recognize my own deficiencies and my own biases in this list. And I'd be really interested to know wintry reads from countries and languages that aren't represented here. So let me know. But for now, thanks for watching.